In the 1980s, the Republic of Korea was going through one of the greatest economic miracles of the 20th century. From having a lower GDP than almost any other nation in Asia and even some African nations, the ROK was absolutely destitute. By the 1980s, the situation in South Korea had completely changed. The economy was rapidly expanding due to economic measures taken by the president at the time, Park Chung-hee, and by that point had even eclipsed North Korea, whose economy for decades had been growing faster to the point where the average North Korean had a better economic outlook and was taller on average. South Korea was no longer a poor country and was now on its way to becoming an economic juggernaut. All the economic miracles of South Korea were an amazing feat by the Korean people, but it came at a cost. Since its inception, South Korea had been under one dictator to the next, from Syngman Rhee, who was elected in a dubious fashion with the American backing in 1948, to his overthrow in 1960, only to lead into the regime of Park Chung-hee. Because of the corruption in South Korea, it had never seen a true democratic government for its entire history. This wasn't a problem when the country was poor and had no other choice but to survive. The Park regime actively resisted democratization, stating the threat from the North Korean regime was too great. However, with wages and standard of living rising, the Korean people were fed up with the strongmen who ruled Korea and their close connections with the chaebols who kept them in power. The discontent was brewing below the surface and democratization movements began to emerge. The city of GwangJu is a moderately sized city in the southwest of South Korea. It was home to light industry and rail networks that are vital for the South Korean economy. In 1980, it was to become home to one of the most pivotal events in South Korean history. During this time, a general by the name of Cho Do-won seized power after the assassination of Park Chung-hee by a KCIA officer. He quickly cemented his control over the country by declaring martial law. Student movements and oppositions parties had long been calling for democratization of South Korea. The seizure of power by another military official was just another example of South Korea's struggle for democratization. Student protests broke out all over Korea to fight against the rule of the new Chun regime and fight for democracy. On May 18th, at the Chungnam National University in Gwangju, students gathered outside to protest the draconian measures that Chun had enacted. They were confronted by South Korea's elite paratroopers who were notorious for their brutality, and fights immediately broke out between the students and the soldiers. Over the course of the next several hours, the protest broadened to include 2,000 people and spread to other areas of the city. The army then deployed additional paratrooper regiments for their Special Warfare Command to the increasingly volatile situation. What happened next was to scar the South Korean memory forever. The paratroopers deployed through the city and went around clubbing and beating protesters and ordinary people who were not involved with the movement. They entered hotels, cafes, office buildings, beating, torturing, and even killing civilians indiscriminately. Eventually, the army began to open fire on pedestrians, killing unarmed protesters and bystanders. By this point, the indiscriminate violence by soldiers caused many residents, including taxi drivers, to join the protests. The few thousand students became tens of thousands of people, and then hundreds of thousands. The protesters raided a police armory, seizing their weapons, and eventually capturing 2 light machine guns from the army. Open battles erupted in the street between paratroopers and the protesters, who had now formed bands of militias. On May 22nd, with the civilian population in full rebellion against the government, the soldiers retreated and left the city to wait for reinforcements. The army blocked all routes outside the city and cut off communication lines. A bus full of people attempting to flee the imminent clash in the city was fired upon, killing 15 of its 18 inhabitants, and then afterwards, 2 surviving passengers were executed by the soldiers. A showdown between the two sides was imminent. On May 26th, the army prepared to re-enter the city. Protesters had gathered in the city center waiting for a clash with the army. Soldiers armed with their American M16 rifles and bulletproof vests entered the city. The notorious paratroopers who had caused so much of the violence at the beginning of the conflict ported regular army fatigues to blend in rather than stir up additional chaos. The clash between the armed protesters and the paratroopers only lasted a few hours before the army was able to seize control of the city. The notorious GwangJu Uprising is one of the deadliest events in South Korean history. There is no official death toll, but the official figures released by the government put it at 550 casualties. Of that, 170 deaths. This claim is dubious at best because the later figures reported in GwangJu City were 2,300 deaths above average for the month of May that year, potentially making the death toll rise to thousands. The protests had a massive impact on South Korean society that paved the way for the eventual democratic elections that took place in 1997, with the election of Kim Dae-jung. In 1995, Chun and his successor Roh Tae-woo were arrested on corruption charges relating to embezzlement of state funds. A law was quickly passed in the South Korean Assembly to charge the two former presidents with their role in the 1979 coup and the GwangJu crackdown. Suspiciously, Kim Dae-jung pushed for their immediate prosecution because it was later found out that some of the funds has been used for his presidential campaign in 1996. Chun was sentenced to death for treason for the coup in 1979 and for acting as an agent of China, and Roh was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Chun's death sentence was later commuted and changed to life. After 2 years, Roh and Chun were given amnesty and released from prison. To this day, the victims of GwangJu have never received any true justice for the deaths of their family and friends during the massacre. Many South Koreans even blame the US for supporting the dictatorial regime of Chun. Today, the city of GwangJu may not show the evidence of what happened, but the scars of the fateful event still remain.